This is the book Winchee, Mission Stories of Colin and Melva Winch by S Ross Goldstone. The true adventures of missionary pilots and nurses in the South Pacific, as retold to the children of Watertown SDA Church. I'm your storyteller, Austin Bacchus. Let's go! Our chapter this week is called Medical Emergencies. While living at Beaulieu, Colin and Melva crossed by boat to Emerau to commence a patrol. As soon as the boat arrived at the wharf, the head teacher of the Tallevu Mission School rushed up to Melva, notifying her she was needed urgently at the clinic. Colin accompanied his wife, but he was not permitted to enter. This was women's business. He gathered the family together and they joined in prayer that God would give Melva skill and to ease the suffering of the poor mother. At that stage, the condition of the baby was not known, though there were grave doubts, because this mother had been in a prolonged labor. On entry, Melva noted a woman lying on the concrete floor. There were no beds in the clinic. The woman was in terrible agony, having been in labor for 3 days. Melva prayed to God for skill to bring the crisis to a successful outcome. On examination, Melva found that the dead baby was presenting sideways and needed to be turned before the birth could be successful. For some hours between contractions, Melva attempted to turn the baby, finally succeeding, and the birth was achieved, much to the relief of the distressed mother. It was another several hours before the placenta was removed. Melva's back ached from being on her knees, bending over the prostrate woman lying on the concrete. There was sadness that the child was stillborn, but the family joined in giving thanks to God for the saving of the mother's life. Word spread of her treatment, and Melva became greatly loved throughout Emerau. Back at Beaulieu, Colin had men's business to attend to. The little clinic had 2 wards, one for each gender. These were made of bush materials with a dispensary and a storeroom made of permanent material in between. Colin dealt with surgical emergencies in this dispensary, equipped with an operating table. One day, he was called to deal with Reuben's wounds resulting from a confrontation with a huge boar. A fence had been erected around the gardens to keep out scavenging wild pigs. Reuben, a schoolboy at the time, had been patrolling the fence when he came across the pig. Armed with a sharpened piece of reinforcing rod, Reuben threw it at the pig. The animal took offense and charged Reuben, tossing him in the air and ripping his buttocks to the bone with his tusks. Reuben was in pain. It was a major wound and very dirty. Before Colin began to deal with the situation, he prayed for skill and comfort for the young man. Realizing it would take a good deal of time to clean and suture, he suggested to Reuben that he give him a general anesthetic, but the patient would have none of it. He wanted to stay awake and know exactly what was going on. Despite Colin's warnings that it was going to be painful, he was adamant and told Colin to do what he had to do and forget about him. After a heavy shot of morphine, Colin and Perere, the doctor boy, set about cleaning the dirt from the deep wound, a task taking the best part of an hour. As a preventative to infection, U.S. Army oily penicillin was used and 100 stitches pulled the wound together. All this time, Reuben lay quiet, periodically asking how the procedure was going. Having done what he could, Colin bowed in prayer, asking God to place his hand of healing on Reuben, a prayer that Reuben said a hearty amen to. Reuben survived, became a fine teacher, and fathered numerous children. Some 15 years later, he and Colin met at Kavieng, and in a private showing, Reuben dropped his trousers and underwear to proudly show the neat scar on his buttocks. I was very proud of that scar, said Colin with a wry smile. On another occasion, Colin was called down to the dispensary at Beaulieu to attend to a little girl, about 10 years old, who had caught her eyelid in a cooking hook. Each village house had a kitchen attached to the rear, in which was a large box-like structure filled with earth on which they placed their fires for cooking. Hanging from the ceiling would be a heavy wire shaped in the form of a hook on which they hung their cooking pots. Apparently, this girl had been playing with her brothers and ran through the kitchen, catching her eyelid on the hook. Her eyelid was almost ripped off, only hanging by a thread of skin. The father brought his injured girl to the dispensary with her eyelid hanging down her face. It was a hideous sight. Colin examined the traumatized girl and decided that the eyelid could be saved with careful surgery. Fortunately, no damage had been done to the eyeball. Without surgery, the girl faced hideous disfigurement for the rest of her life. After prayer to the divine healer for guidance and skill, the decision was made to give the girl a general anesthetic. Before doing so, Colin asked whether she had eaten over the previous 4 hours. On being assured in the negative by the father, the girl was anesthetized, and Colin began the delicate task of stitching the torn eyelid back in place. Partway through the procedure, the patient gave a big heave and stopped breathing. Rolling her on her side, Colin gave her a thump on the back. Out popped a large piece of recently eaten sweet potato and other tropical vegetables. The girl most certainly had eaten, and probably within the past hour. The obstruction removed and breathing restored, Colin completed the suturing. After a prayer of thanks to God, the little girl was returned into the care of her relieved family. Some 12 months later, he again saw the patient and was happy with the long-term results. Apart from a slight droop of the eyelid, there was no obvious disfigurement. Caring for an emergency outside of the family is one thing, but an emergency within the family is a different thing altogether. 2-year-old Carrie had been pushing baby Carol in a little pusher around the lounge room floor of their Beaulieu home when she accidentally upset the pusher, tipping the baby out onto the floor. Carrie then fell down onto the pusher and cut her chin just below her bottom lip. 2 children screamed in unison, causing Melva to run to see what was the problem. For a moment she was unsure whether to tend to the baby first or to Carrie, but the blood streaming from the cut on Carrie's chin quickly settled the issue. An urgent message was sent for Colin to come from the school to examine the wound. Obviously, it required 3 or 4 sutures, and preparations were made to carry out the procedure. Melva was nursing Carrie on her knee, but when the child saw the needle, she resisted vigorously, fighting like a little tiger. Carrie had experienced needles before, and she was having none of it. The parents waited for her to calm down and tried again, with the same result. Eventually, they decided to just pull the wound together with sticking plaster and hope for the best. To this day, Carrie carries the scar to inform her of an incident she has no memory of. The next chapter is Life on a Mission Station. Early in 1961, Colin and Melva, with their 2 young daughters, 4-year-old Carrie and 2-year-old Carol, traveled to their new mission appointment at Oriomo, 3-hour sail up the Oriomo River from Daru, and only 5 meters above sea level. Melva was pregnant with their 3rd child, Nerali, born on June 14 of that year. En route from Port Moresby, they joined Pastor Elwin Martin aboard the MV Urahina. Now, listeners who have heard some of our stories from other books will remember Pastor Elwin Martin is from the book I Saw God's Hand. They were planning to visit the mission headquarters at Karo Karo on the Vailala River before going on to Oriomo. Sailing in the heavy seas of the Papuan Gulf, the boat pitched and rolled wildly. Melva and the children soon became violently seasick. The Vailala Bar was known to be extremely dangerous, particularly if a southeasterly wind was blowing, as it was on this occasion. As the boat approached the Vailala River, huge waves were crashing over the bar, sending a haze of spume heavenward. From the deck level, it was impossible to see the passage through the bar, so the national captain, William, climbed up the mast, in spite of the boat being tossed about like a cork, to try to guide the boat to the appropriate winding passage to the calmer deep waters of the Vailala River. It was a hazardous exercise. The huge following swells were surfing the boat toward the bar as the brave captain strained to find the break in the pounding surf. Suddenly he shouted, "Henia Tabada! Give it to her now, master!" A huge roller picked up the boat and drove it onto the sand, missing the passage. Swung side on to the pounding waves, the Urahina was lifted and dumped, lifted and dumped, lifted and dumped. Boom, boom, boom! It was a frightening experience for all on board, particularly for seasick Melva, as she thought of the risk to the lives of her 2 children. After about half an hour of continuous pounding, the boat was pushed into the deep waters of the river. Prayers of thanks ascended, and racing hearts returned to a more normal beat as the Urahina made its way up the river to the mission station. But it was only a temporary respite. A brief stop over, and then the Urahina was again sailed into the open waters of the Papuan Gulf before entering the murky waters of the Oriomo River. When the Winch family finally arrived at Oriomo, they were hit with energy-sapping, intense heat and humidity. Melva's heart sank as they took occupancy of their home, a native shack constructed of pit-pit, a type of bamboo, and beaten palm fronds woven into a wall cladding. The thatch leaf roof was infested with rats and leaked during heavy rain. The wooden floorboards were not tongue and grooved, and due to shrinkage allowed mosquitoes entry to the home. Millions of mosquitoes! They came through the windows and the walling, as well as up through the floor. The house was elevated due to the possibility of floods, access being via a set of steps. There was no running water in the house, and the smelly pit toilet was outside some distance from the main building. Adjacent to the house was a small office on which was an iron roof that shed water into a small holding tank. This provided water for household use, but involved carrying the water by bucket some 100 yards. Bathing was carried out in the privacy of darkness when the family went down to the jetty, stripped to the bare necessities, and tipped buckets of water over themselves. The river was crocodile infested, so they did not dare to swim in the cooling waters. Mosquitoes, crocodiles, and heat were not the only problems. 3 types of deadly snakes were prolific in the area: the Papuan black, the taipan, and the death adder. It was not unusual to find a Papuan black curled up on the toilet seat, a frightening experience, particularly at night. One day, Carrie was clambering down the steps and began to scream in terror. On the bottom step lay a deadly taipan. With Colin frequently away, Melva had to be always on the alert. A backwater of the Oriomo River separated the Oriomo village from the mission home. A coconut tree trunk had been felled to form a bridge across the backwater some 10 feet above water level. This would spring up and down as a person made the crossing. This was a particular challenge when Melva was sometimes called out at night to deliver a village baby. Crossing the tree trunk bridge by lantern light was a nerve-wracking experience, with the possibility of an unwanted fall into the backwater a constant reality. Colin was often away for weeks at a time, visiting villages along the rivers, leaving Melva and the children as the only Europeans in the area. The increased responsibility of care for the children's safety sometimes meant a sleepless night of reading for the ever-alert pregnant mother. Living conditions improved late in 1961 when David Lambert, a builder from Brisbane, arrived to construct a new home for the missionaries. Leaving Colin and David to this project, Melva and the girls sailed to Port Moresby to await Nerali's birth. Again, they suffered from seasickness throughout the trip. One evening, as the 2 men were sitting at the table eating their evening meal, Colin noticed a large Papuan black snake dangling from the thatched ceiling directly behind David's head, while David was totally oblivious to the danger that he was in. "David, stay still. Don't move," said Colin. Thinking Colin was playing a trick on him, David called out, "What do you mean?" and spun around, meeting face to face with a venomous snake. It is arguable who got the biggest fright. Fortunately, the 7-foot-long creature dropped to the floor and slithered away. Life in the mission field was not without excitement. There was no relief day or night from the heat and humidity. Heavy showers would fall, followed by the blasting heat of the sun, making physical work under such conditions very draining. They would cool off by taking turns for a quick dip in the cool waters of the Oriomo River, while the non-swimmer would stand on the jetty watching for crocodiles. It was a refreshing but a dangerous luxury. Mail was always looked forward to, but no postman made deliveries to this isolated area. To collect the mail required a day-long paddle in a canoe to Daru and a 2-day return trip. On one occasion, the 2 men made the journey, not using the mission-launched DRE, as this could only be used for official mission work, due to budgetary restrictions. Paddling downstream with the current was pleasurable compared with paddling against the current on the return trip. This involved an overnight stop, somewhere on the bank of the Oriomo River, a risky venture due to the presence of hungry crocodiles. However, exhaustion ensured a sound sleep under a grass-roof shelter, and the crocodiles failed to take advantage of their sleeping feast. The timber-framed, fibro-clad, iron-roofed house took 4 months to complete. Constructed on stilts to allow for any cooling breeze and to keep the rats out, the living quarters were above and the laundry shower downstairs. This meant no more bucket showers, no more mosquitoes at night. They were kept out by the fine mesh screens on all windows. Melva was delighted.
Be sure to tune in next time for more stories from the book Winchee by S Ross Goldstone, which is available at the Adventist Book Center. And meanwhile, check out these videos and others on my channel, with many more mission stories and Bible skits for kids and adults. God bless you.